Anzac Day is very critical from a point of view of commemorating the Australian and New Zealand forces in Gallipoli. And what's that historical significance of Anzac Day in connection to the Gallipoli and broadly as well?
Yeah, Anzac Day is intimately connected with the idea of Australian nationhood. Australia Day, the 26th of January, a date that's also of significance in India, of course, but Australia Day has been tainted by the association with the initial British colonisation. Lots of people call it Invasion Day. So Australians have always had an ambiguous relationship with Australia Day. But Anzac Day has always been associated with the idea of Australian nationhood. It's the de facto national day. Why is that so? I think it's because Australia, as you know, federated in 1901, basically as a kind of administrative process. The writing of the Constitution was a very bureaucratic almost process. It was political, but it certainly wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the result of a revolution or a civil war or a war of independence. So Australians, I think, growing up, being in a world that associated the creation of nations with the idea of blood sacrifice. Think of all the nations created in the 19th century. You know, the Germans, the Italians, the nations of Europe that were struggling to assert their own identity. Australians wanted, at the time, an opportunity to sort of feel that they proved themselves as a nation. And the First World War, the Great War, gave them that opportunity. So very early on in the Gallipoli campaign, Australians were saying, this has made us a nation, because they were imbued with that idea of blood sacrifice, that somehow an administrative act by the British Parliament to create the Australian nation wasn't enough. It needed blood, and Gallipoli supplied that blood. I think also, as the Great War ground on and tens of thousands of Australians died, Australians needed to find a justification for all of those deaths. So the idea grew up, especially promoted by people like the historian Charles Bean and the Prime Minister Billy Hughes, that the Australian nation was born on the beaches or the cliffs of Gallipoli.
Wow.
So you get a very close coincidence between Gallipoli and the idea of Australian nationhood. And then, of course, it becomes associated very strongly with the idea of remembering those 60,000 odd dead. And that, of course, becomes entrenched in the Australian calendar and in the Australian mentality. And Australians, although the way they've marked Anzac Day has changed, it's always been an important day, and it's always had a connotation of a connection with national identity.